I want to talk about the PUFAs because and the seed oils and some of these oils that are in healthy foods that may be backfiring, and that I've heard you talk about as well, where these are low carb calories, right? These are fats and it's supposed to be okay. What are PUFAs and what are they doing in your body?
Yeah, great question. So the PUFAs hit the utilization end to some extent, and also the circulation end of that three-part process of converting food to energy that I talked about. So the polyunsaturated fats, particularly the omega-6 polyunsaturated fats, which are extremely rich inside the Western diet due to the advent of canola oil, soybean oil, safflower oil, etc. And so what happens when these omega-6 polyunsaturated fats circulate, especially if they've been heated, because in most of the Western diet, they're heated, and the processed foods, they're heated. When you go out to a restaurant, they're heated. They create lipid peroxides. So these lipid peroxides are essentially, if you think of this fatty acid as a piece of glass and you break that glass, you have a bunch of shards. And so the shards from these lipid peroxides can be very damaging to the gastrointestinal tract by itself, and then also damaging inside the vasculature and create what they find in plaques inside people's arteries is high amounts of oxidized linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 polyunsaturated fat. And this is one of the major omega-6 polyunsaturated fat found inside the Western diet. So you have this damage to this system, this highway that's trying to transport all the goods and services that your cells need. That's problem number one. Problem number two is when you get into the mitochondria and you start to build your structure out of this glass, right? Instead of steel or instead of concrete. If you think of the mitochondria in the cell as a nuclear power plant, I don't know many nuclear power plants that are made of glass. It's probably not a good idea to construct this out of glass. So when you start to incorporate large amounts of polyunsaturated fatty acids inside the mitochondrial membrane, when the mitochondria starts to produce energy, you can actually have problems because while you're producing this energy, you're burning, you're creating a little bit of smoke called reactive oxygen species. It can start to directly damage the membrane and structure the mitochondria and alter its function down the line in a negative way, especially if antioxidant defenses in the mitochondria aren't dialed in effectively or aren't optimized. So you have this fatty acid that if it's very liable to be damaged, and if it starts getting incorporated into the structures, it creates problems. And when the damaged pieces themselves start to create problems. And in the third way, these polyunsaturated fatty acids, what they do is they are the major precursors to the inflammatory mediators in the body called the eicosanoids. So in different animal studies, when you start to load these animals up on these fatty acids, the omega-6 fatty acids, when they are exposed to an inflammatory stimulus like an infection, they have a much stronger inflammatory response than the animals that aren't loaded up on these polyunsaturated fatty acids. So basically, you're like loading your tissues up with this dynamite, and as long as there's no fuse, you're fine. You're good to go. But as soon as you get a fuse, as soon as you light that fuse, now you can start chain reactions for inflammation and lipid peroxidation, these different problems that are extremely damaging to the body, to the cells, etc. And then this ultimately, the inflammatory mediators, the change in mitochondrial function, all of this is going to affect the ability to take your food, the whole foods that you mentioned, and convert them into energy effectively. So this is just, again, polyunsaturated fats are just one example of these different compounding factors that are working against us and improving our health. And it's through these mechanisms.
And the goal is to increase ATP, increase mitochondrial health for longevity, for weight loss, for energy, all of these things. And this is one thing that is stealing that ATP and lowering your mitochondrial health. The thing is about these PUFAs is they're not like sugar that are in and out of your body within a day. They're staying in the tissue. So how long does it take? Because everyone's listening going, okay, so I'll stop eating them. But what about the ones that I've already eaten for the last 40, 50 years?
That's a great question. And I don't want to be a party pooper on how long it takes to get rid of them. but it's likely anywhere between a year to 4 years process, depending on how loaded the tissues are. However, that doesn't necessarily mean, though, that you can't drastically improve your health by minimizing them now and changing your diet and increasing the antioxidant defenses and lowering the production of these inflammatory mediators and minimizing these sparks that you're exposed to. Like, for example, the toxins coming from the gut bacteria, these external stressors, forcing fat oxidation through being very low carb and in ketosis over an extended period of time. So when you start to minimize the stressors and then you start to change the diet over time, you can slowly get rid of these fatty acids from the fat tissue and slowly start to change what's going on with the cellular structures and different components, because the body is the cells are constantly turning over. They're constantly renewing themselves over time. And so it's, if it's not like a death sentence, it's not terrible that you have this thing now. It's not too late to make this switch and move in another direction and start to adjust the diet and start to incorporate other fat sources. Things like olive oil are fine. Things like avocados are fine. Things like coconut oil is okay. If you tolerate dairy, then butter can be okay. Cream can be okay. The fat from beef is fine. All of these components are okay. And these would be the fat sources that I'd start to switch into your diet and minimize a lot of the polyunsaturated fatty acids. And the other thing is, even just minimizing eating a lot of processed foods, as you mentioned, Sara, just taking those out of the diet will go a long way to minimizing the polyunsaturated fatty acids, particularly the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are, I think, in the Western diet now, actually some of the most problematic factors. There are omega-3s, and we don't want to get a massive amount of them, but most people who are not in the health sphere are not loading up on high dose omega-3 supplementation. They're more just eating a lot of processed foods heavy in omega-6s. Now, we can talk about omega-3s at another point, but the major piece to keep in mind, and then the takeaway that I would say, is drastically lower processed foods, drastically lower eating at restaurants that are frying in these oils, because heating these oils is highly problematic. Switch to the other fat sources that I mentioned, add those into your diet, use those to cook instead of safflower oil, sunflower oil, soybean oil, corn oil, etc. And then make sure that your diet is dialed in with your micronutrients, your vitamins, and your minerals, because those vitamins and minerals are absolutely essential for the enzymes inside your mitochondria and inside your body and circulating around your bloodstream to protect you from reactive oxygen species stress, lipid peroxidation, and then these inflammatory mediators. We want to make sure that all of this stuff is dialed in so that even though we're a little bit loaded up on this dynamite, we are able to minimize all of the sparks that would set it off.
I love this. And just a side note on restaurants. One of my very favorite restaurants, clean, high end. I go in and I order the salmon or the trout, thinking I'm super healthy. And same with my husband. And he's got a solid gut. He can take anything. And the next morning he goes, they're using something in that oil. Most of these restaurants are not using olive oil. It is olive oil cut with canola oil or some other oil in there. And so here you are trying to do the right thing. And I don't want to be the party pooper either. However, the more you can cook in your own home and eat the whole foods, you're not going to binge on potatoes or whole potatoes or a ribeye steak or whatever. You're not going to binge on that type of food. You're going to binge on the Pringles and the Ben and Jerry's because of the way it's designed.